In the early summer of 1948, 11-year-old Florence Sally Horner left her house believing she would be home soon, but she did not come back. How does a child disappear without running away, without being chased, without leaving behind a scene that looks like danger? How does someone vanish not into darkness, but into obedience, in a place where people believed safety came from rules and familiarity? If this story found you tonight, let us know. Where you're listening from, Camden County in the late 1940s was a place built on predictability. It sat along the Delaware River, shaped by factories, rail yards, and steady work that had carried families through the war years. Shift whistles marked the hours. Trains came and went on schedule. Streets were lined with modest houses, their porches swept clean, their windows open in the summer to let in air and sound. Radios played softly in kitchens, carrying music and news through thin walls. Neighbors recognized one another's routines without needing to speak. Children moved freely here. They walked to school, ran errands, crossed streets without hands held tight. Parents believed they would notice if something was wrong. They believed danger would look like danger, loud, sudden, unmistakable. Nothing bad ever happened here, or at least nothing that fit the picture people carried in their minds. Sally Horner lived in one of those houses with her mother, Ella. The home was small but orderly, shaped by necessity more than comfort. Ella was a seamstress, a woman whose days were spent bent over fabric, measuring, cutting, stitching, and starting again. She worked long hours and carried responsibility quietly, the way many widowed women of that era did. She believed in structure, in rules, in teaching children how to behave properly so they would stay out of trouble. Sally had absorbed those lessons deeply. She was small for her age, careful in her movements, serious in a way adults found reassuring. At school, she earned good grades, not because she was exceptionally gifted, but because she tried. She listened. She followed instructions. She rarely needed to be corrected. When she was named president of her junior Red Cross Club, she accepted the role solemnly as if it were an oath. Being trusted mattered to her. Being seen as good mattered even more. Her older half-sister Susan had once been her constant presence. Susan walked her places, helped her with homework, reminded her when she forgot things. But by the summer of 1948, Susan's life was changing. She was married now. She was expecting a baby. She was still part of Sally's daily life, but not in the same way. Sally noticed the difference and adapted quietly, as she always did. On Tuesday, June 15th, Sally woke early. The house was already warm. Summer had settled in, and the air pressed gently against the thin curtains in her bedroom. Sally lay still for a moment, listening to the sounds that told her everything was normal. The refrigerator humming, a truck passing outside, the soft creak of the house as it woke. She got out of bed and dressed. Sally took her time choosing her clothes, standing in front of the small mirror above her dresser. She smoothed her blouse, tugged her skirt into place, pulled her socks up straight. A loose strand of hair fell across her forehead and she pushed it back, checking her reflection again. She wanted to look neat. Looking neat meant she was doing things right. In the kitchen, Ella was moving through her morning routine, coffee already poured back by the door. She glanced at Sally and took in the details without stopping: the pressed blouse, the straight socks, the quiet way her daughter waited. "You look nice," Ella said, not warmly, not coldly, just as a statement of fact. Sally felt a small, familiar sense of relief. Approval mattered. Ella reminded her to write while she was away. It was not said with urgency. Writing was simply what responsible girls did when they traveled. Sally nodded. "I will," she said. "I'll write every day." Ella nodded once. That was enough. Sally stepped outside shortly after. The street was already awake. Screen doors opened and closed along the block. Somewhere down the way, a radio played a morning program. The pavement was warm beneath her shoes. She walked down the street without looking back, believing she would return before long. The man she was meeting that morning did not frighten her. She had met him months earlier under circumstances that had already placed him above her. She had been caught trying to steal a small notebook from a store, a childish dare that left her embarrassed and afraid. Instead of calling the police or raising his voice, the man had spoken calmly. He had leaned down slightly so he did not tower over her. "I work for the government," he had told her. "Do you know how serious this is?" She had shaken her head, eyes down, heart racing. "I could send you away for this," he said. "But I don't think you're a bad girl." That was when she began to listen. From that moment on, Sally believed he had authority over her. He spoke confidently, never hurried her, never appeared angry. He used words she associated with rules and consequences. When he told her to report to him, she did. When he told her not to tell her mother, she obeyed. "This is just between us," he said once. "I don't want to scare her." Sally accepted that explanation. Adults protected parents from worry. That made sense. When he explained that arrangements had been made for a short trip, that everything was approved, Sally did not question it. He sounded certain, official, kind. On that Tuesday morning, Sally got into his car without resistance, without fear. She believed she was following instructions. She believed she was doing what she was supposed to do. At home, the day passed as usual. Ella went to work. Susan went about her routine. By evening, the house felt quiet, but not alarmingly so. Sally was expected back later. There was no reason yet to worry. Days passed. The first letter arrived soon after Sally left. It said the trip was lasting longer than planned. The handwriting was neat and familiar. Ella read it at the kitchen table and felt the tightness in her chest ease slightly. "She's fine," she said aloud to no one. "Just staying a little longer." Another letter came. Then another. Each one explained a delay. Each one promised a return. The letters arrived just often enough to keep panic at bay. Ella kept them stacked, neatly smoothing the paper flat each time she reread them. By the end of July, the letters changed. They grew shorter, the explanations thinner. The final one arrived near the end of the month. It offered no clear return date. It ended with a sentence that unsettled Ella deeply. Sally wrote that she did not want to write anymore. After that, there were no more letters. At first, Ella told herself not to overreact. Children grew tired of writing. Trips were busy. But days passed and the silence continued. Sally's room remained untouched. Her shoes stayed by the door. Her notebooks lay where she had left them. At night, the house felt heavier. Ella lay awake, replaying the same moments, the careful way Sally had dressed, the way she had walked down the street without looking back. She thought about the man Sally had mentioned in passing weeks earlier, the one who worked for the government. She wondered why she had not asked more questions. "She'd tell me if something was wrong," Ella whispered once into the dark. But the words did not bring comfort. Our community knows this moment. The space between unease and certainty. The hours spent convincing yourself not to panic. The quiet fear that grows stronger each day you do nothing. By the end of that summer, Sally Horner had not come home. No one yet knew where she was or what had happened to her. All that existed was a growing absence, a stack of unanswered questions, and a family standing at the edge of action, not yet knowing how far they would have to go. By the time Ella Horner admitted to herself that waiting was no longer an option, more than a week had passed since Sally had left. At first, she had told herself that the silence meant nothing. Children forgot to write. Trips changed. But the days had continued to stack up one after another, and the house had begun to feel wrong, too still, too empty for a place where a child was supposed to return at any moment. The decision to call for help did not come with clarity. It came with exhaustion. Ella stood in the kitchen one morning staring at the calendar without really seeing it. Dates had been circled and crossed out, promises of return rewritten in her mind until they no longer sounded convincing. She picked up the phone and dialed, her hand steady even as something inside her tightened. She gave Sally's name, her age, the date she had left. She explained the letters, the delays, the silence that had followed. As she spoke, she found herself choosing her words carefully, as if the wrong phrasing might make the situation sound worse than it already was. When she hung up, she remained standing there for a long moment, the receiver still warm in her hand. Whatever happened next was no longer under her control. The first officer arrived that afternoon. He parked at the curb and took a moment before getting out of the car, scanning the street the way officers do when they are trying to reconcile what they have been told with what they can see. The neighborhood looked peaceful, too peaceful. Children played a few houses down. A woman hung laundry in her yard. Nothing about the scene suggested urgency. Inside, he sat at the kitchen table with Ella and Susan. A small notebook lay open in front of him. He asked for details and wrote them down slowly, carefully stopping now and then to clarify a date or a name. "When was the last time you saw her? What exactly did she say when she left? Did she take any clothes with her? Did she mention the man's name again?" Susan answered when Ella hesitated. Ella answered when Susan's voice tightened. Between them, they reconstructed the morning as best they could, replaying it aloud in a way neither had done before. Each detail sounded harmless on its own. Together they felt fragile. She wouldn't just leave, Susan said, her voice firm. She follows rules. She always has. The officer nodded, but he did not write that down. He had learned long ago that certainty from family members, however sincere, was not evidence. By the end of that day, Sally was officially listed as missing. The next morning, the search began in earnest. Officers walked the streets. Sally normally traveled, stopping at corners, looking behind hedges and fences, checking alleyways and empty lots. They spoke to neighbors, shopkeepers, anyone who might have seen a girl matching Sally's description in the days since she had left. Most people remembered her only vaguely. A quiet girl, polite. One woman thought she might have seen her walking with a man near the main road, but she could not be sure. Another believed she had seen someone who looked like her on a bus, but the timing did not quite fit. Each possible sighting was written down. Each one raised hope briefly before collapsing under scrutiny. Officers visited the store where Sally had once been caught stealing the notebook. The clerk remembered her, clearly remembered the man who had intervened. He described him as older, well-dressed, calm, someone who spoke with authority. He said he was with the government, the clerk recalled. Sounded official. That detail stood out immediately. Names were exchanged. Descriptions compared. The man's explanation was noted carefully. But government was a broad word, and without a last name, without an address, it led nowhere at first. Search parties were organized. Volunteers gathered after work, men and women who knew the area well, and believed that if Sally were nearby, they would find her. They combed wooded patches, checked abandoned buildings, walked along roads and paths where a child might wander. They found nothing. No dropped shoe, no torn clothing, no sign of a struggle. The absence of evidence began to feel like its own kind of clue, though no one could yet say what it meant. Flyers were printed and distributed. Sally's photograph, taken not long before her disappearance, stared out from telephone poles and storefront windows. Her face was serious, composed, almost older than her years. People stopped to look, murmuring quietly to one another. "She looks like a good girl," someone said more than once, as if that might explain something. Churches mentioned Sally during services. Her name was folded into prayers spoken softly from pulpits and pews. Women approached Ella afterward, squeezing her hand, offering reassurances that sounded hollow even as they were given. "She'll come home," one said. "You'll see." Ella nodded because that was what people expected her to do. By the third day, officers began widening the search beyond the immediate neighborhood. They checked bus stations, train platforms, places where a child might have gone if she were confused or frightened. They spoke to drivers, ticket clerks, anyone who might have noticed a girl traveling alone or with an adult. Again and again, the same problem emerged. Without knowing when Sally had left exactly where she had gone or who she had gone with, the investigation had too many open ends. Each lead branched into more questions. Ella was asked to recount every interaction Sally had mentioned in the weeks before she left. Friends at school, teachers, adults who had shown interest. The name Frank came up more than once, attached to vague descriptions and half-remembered details. "He said he worked for the government," Ella repeated, her voice growing thinner each time. Sally believed him. Susan clenched her jaw. She replayed moments she had dismissed at the time, things Sally had said, casually comments about reporting in, about rules she could not break. None of it had sounded alarming then. Now it all sounded dangerous. By the end of the first week, the search had taken on a rhythm. Officers rotated shifts. Volunteers came and went. Tips poured in, then slowed. Each phone call brought a jolt of hope, followed by disappointment. One caller claimed to have seen Sally in a neighboring town walking with a man who looked like her father. Officers drove there immediately, questioned residents, checked records. The description did not match. Another tip suggested she had been seen near the river. Searchers returned to areas already covered, combing them again with greater intensity. Still nothing. Our community knows this stage well. The phase where every possibility is considered, no matter how unlikely. Where hope latches onto even the smallest detail, simply because there is nothing else to hold. Inside the Horner house, time began to feel distorted. Ella stopped noticing the difference between morning and afternoon. She ate without tasting food. She slept only in short bursts, waking suddenly with the conviction that she had heard Sally's footsteps on the porch. Each time, the silence that followed felt heavier than before. Susan tried to keep things moving. She answered the phone. She wrote down names and numbers. She spoke to officers when Ella's voice failed her. At night, she sat with her mother at the kitchen table, both of them staring at the same stack of flyers, the same unanswered questions. She wouldn't just stop writing, Susan said, once her voice breaking despite her effort to keep it steady. Not like that. Ella nodded. That was the detail she could not shake. Sally had always written. She liked rules. She liked doing things properly. For her to suddenly decide she did not want to write anymore felt wrong in a way Ella could not fully articulate. As the second week began, the tone of the investigation shifted subtly. Officers continued their work, but the urgency softened around the edges. Conversations grew more cautious. People stopped using words like when and began using if. No one said it aloud in front of Ella, but she sensed the change immediately. The flyers remained on poles and windows, their edges beginning to curl slightly in the summer heat. Sally's photograph faded just a little, the ink no longer as dark as it had been days before. Ella began marking the calendar again, though she no longer circled dates. She simply crossed them off at night, one by one, each mark a reminder that another day had passed without answers. Sometimes she caught herself imagining Sally walking back up the street embarrassed by the attention, ready to explain everything. Those moments of imagined return were crueler than despair. They made reality harder to accept. Our community understands this too. The way hope can sustain you and wound you at the same time. The way waiting becomes its own form of suffering. By the end of the second week, life began to press in around the search. People returned to work, children went back to school. Officers were reassigned as new cases demanded attention. The search did not stop, but it no longer consumed every hour. For Ella, nothing else existed. Each morning began with the same question. Would today be the day someone called with real news? Each night ended the same way, with silence. By the time summer edged toward fall, Sally Horner was no longer just missing. She was a case file growing thicker with notes and thinner with hope. A name spoken carefully, as if saying it too often might make the truth harder to bear. The frantic energy of the early days had faded, replaced by something colder and more frightening. The realization that whatever had happened to Sally was not going to be resolved quickly, and that the waiting they had already endured was only the beginning. By the time the case reached its second decade, it no longer lived in anyone's day-to-day awareness. The neighborhood where Sally Horner had once walked home from school had changed in quiet, ordinary ways. Children grew up and moved away. New families arrived without knowing which house had once held a girl whose face had filled windows and church bulletin boards. The streets were repaved. Trees grew taller. The past settled under layers of normal life. Inside Ella Horner's home, time had stalled. Not dramatically. Not in a way visitors would immediately notice. The house was clean. The furniture was rearranged occasionally. The calendar still hung on the wall and was still turned each month. But certain things did not move forward. Certain spaces remained untouched by change. Sally's room was no longer preserved as it once had been. Ella had learned that leaving everything frozen only made the silence louder. Some items were put away carefully. Others were given to charity. But nothing was ever thrown out. Every object passed through Ella's hands first weighed not for usefulness but for meaning. Years earlier, investigators had warned her that time worked against cases like Sally's. Evidence degraded, memories blurred, witnesses died or moved away. But Ella had not needed that explained to her. She felt time working against her every day in ways no report could capture. Susan felt it too, though she carried it differently. She had grown into a kind of vigilance that never switched off. She watched her own child with an awareness that bordered on fear, noticing every stranger, every delay, every unexplained change in routine. She did not say much about Sally anymore, not because she had forgotten, but because saying her name had begun to feel like reopening a wound that never closed properly. The case file remained. It sat in storage, thick and unwieldy, pulled down only when anything suggested it might still hold answers. When it was reopened, it was never with excitement, only with cautious obligation, a sense that before giving up entirely, someone needed to be able to say they had tried one more time. This final review began without ceremony. A detective who had not been part of the original investigation requested the file. He was younger than the others who had worked it before, unburdened by years of frustration. He approached it methodically, reconstructing the timeline from the beginning, reading every note as if it might contain something everyone else had missed. He lingered on the early details. The way Sally had left willingly, the absence of panic in her letters, the calm authority of the man who had spoken to her. He did not rush past these things the way others had. He treated them not as background information but as clues in themselves. He began asking questions that had not been asked so directly before. What kind of man could convince a child to comply without force? What kind of authority did not require proof? What kind of confidence allowed someone to move through the world without fear of being challenged? Those questions shifted the direction of the search. Instead of focusing on known offenders with violent histories, the detective began looking for men who blended in easily, men who traveled, men who worked jobs that allowed them to move without scrutiny, men who used names loosely who did not leave strong footprints behind them. Records were pulled that had not existed in the 1940s. Employment documents, social registrations, old arrest logs that had never been cross-referenced across state lines. Patterns emerged, then faded. One name appeared repeatedly attached to different addresses, different spellings, different claimed histories. It was enough to justify attention, not enough to justify certainty. Investigators followed the trail carefully. They tracked the name across several states. They spoke to people who had known a man who fit the description. Each interview added texture but not clarity. The man was remembered as polite, unremarkable, the kind of person you noticed only if you were looking closely. Dates were checked against Sally's disappearance. They did not line up cleanly. The trail grew cold again. Another potential lead came from a school enrollment record flagged during a routine review. A girl had appeared mid-year with minimal documentation. Her age was close. Her demeanor, according to a teacher's notes, was exceptionally compliant. The record was decades old, nearly forgotten. Investigators tracked it down. The girl existed. She had lived where the record indicated. She had a history that could be verified, however incomplete it appeared at first glance. When her background was examined more closely, it became clear that she was not Sally Horner. The disappointment landed heavily. By now, the pattern was familiar. A lead emerged. Energy gathered. Careful steps were taken. Then, inevitably, the path ended in nothing. Each time, it became harder to convince anyone. Investigators concluded that continuing made sense. Ella was informed of the renewed efforts in the same measured way she had been for years. "There's something we're looking at," the detective said. "It may not amount to anything, but we felt it was worth following." Ella listened without interruption. She asked where they were looking. She asked what had changed. After the call ended, she sat quietly, hands folded, the receiver resting in its cradle. She did not allow herself to imagine outcomes. Experience had taught her that imagining only sharpened the fall. Susan reacted with guarded tension. "How long will it take?" she asked. "We don't know yet," came the answer. She nodded already, bracing herself. Weeks passed. The investigation moved forward in fragments. One record led to another. One conversation suggested a new angle. None of it came together in a way that could be held up as proof. Eventually, the detective returned to the file itself, spreading documents across a table, trying to see them not as individual failures but as part of a larger shape. The shape still did not resolve. What remained was absence, long, unbroken, and resistant to explanation. At a certain point, the effort began to feel like an exercise in endurance rather than discovery. Investigators worked not because they expected a breakthrough, but because stopping felt like an admission they were not ready to make. Ella sensed the shift before it was spoken. The calls became less frequent. The tone changed subtly. Words like possibility and avenue gave way to limitations and realities. When the final update came, it was brief. "We've reached the end of what we can pursue with the information we have," the detective said. "If anything new comes in, we'll act on it immediately." Ella thanked him. Afterward, she did not sit down. She moved through the house instead, straightening things that did not need straightening, touching objects without looking at them, occupying herself with motion because stillness felt dangerous. Susan arrived later that evening. They did not talk much. "We did everything," Susan said, eventually, more to herself than to her mother. Ella nodded once. She did not say yes. She did not say no. Outside, the world continued, as it always had. Cars passed. Lights came on in neighboring houses. Somewhere, people laughed. Inside, the waiting remained. There were no more leads on the horizon. No reason to expect change. The search, such as it had been, had reached its furthest edge. Neither Ella nor Susan knew then that this exhaustion, this sense of finality, was not the end. They only knew that they had reached the point where hope no longer arrived loudly. It lingered instead, quiet and stubborn, refusing to disappear even when there was nothing left to feed it. The truth, wherever it was, remained hidden, and the house in New Jersey went to sleep once more without answers. The silence that finally began to crack did not arrive as an emergency, nor did it announce itself with urgency or drama. It surfaced quietly, almost accidentally, during a routine administrative process that had nothing on its face to do with a missing girl from New Jersey decades earlier. A clerk reviewing archived records as part of a broader effort to consolidate older files into a newer system noticed a series of inconsistencies that refused to resolve no matter how many times she cross-checked them. The name itself did not stand out, nor did the dates when viewed in isolation, but when she laid the documents side by side, something about the pattern unsettled her. Birth years shifted slightly from one form to the next, addresses appeared briefly and then vanished, and employment records began and ended without explanation, as though the man had learned exactly how much information to provide in order to pass unnoticed. This was not in itself evidence of wrongdoing. Many people left messy paper trails, especially those who moved frequently or worked jobs that required little oversight. Still, the clerk hesitated, lingering over the file longer than she needed, too aware that she was reacting more to instinct than to protocol. Before she closed the folder, she forwarded it for secondary review, more out of caution than conviction. When the record reached the detective who had last reviewed the Horner case, he recognized the name, not with excitement, but with a dull sense of recognition, the kind that came from years of circling the same unanswered questions. He had encountered this individual once before, long ago, during an earlier attempt to map men who fit the description of the stranger Sally had trusted. At the time, the trail had gone nowhere, collapsing under the limits of the records available then. This time, the context was different. The detective reopened Sally's file without notifying anyone outside his immediate circle, unwilling to raise expectations until he understood what he was looking at. He began by reconstructing the man's movements year by year, not assuming guilt but searching for continuity. Slowly, as he aligned documents that had once lived in isolation, patterns emerged that had not been visible before. Names changed, but habits did not. Addresses shifted, but always within reach of familiar institutions. Jobs appeared and disappeared, yet followed a logic that suggested intentional movement rather than chance. One detail buried deep within the paperwork forced him to stop and start again. A dependent appeared in the records abruptly, without the gradual buildup that typically accompanied a child's documented life. There were no early medical entries, no birth registration connected to a known family, no prior school enrollment. The child simply existed on paper from one year to the next, fully formed, attached to the man by a designation that explained nothing. The detective did not assume what this meant. He verified the information through separate channels, confirming that the record had not been entered in error, that it had not been duplicated or misfiled. Each confirmation strengthened the same uneasy conclusion. Whoever this child was, her documented history began midstream without roots. He convened a small team, chosen carefully, and laid the documents out in front of them without commentary. He watched as they noticed the same things he had one by one, the room growing quieter as the implications became harder to ignore. No one spoke of Sally directly at first, aware of the damage such speculation could do if it proved unfounded. They worked backward, methodically tracing each alias to its origin, each address to its previous occupant, each piece of paper to the system that had generated it. As the hours stretched into days, the gaps that had once seemed insurmountable began to narrow, not because the answers were obvious, but because the questions had finally become precise. Eventually, the most recent identity led them to a residential address that did not stand out in any meaningful way. The house sat on a street that blended into its surroundings, maintained well enough to avoid attention, unremarkable in the way that offered privacy rather than suspicion. There were no complaints attached to it, no reports filed by neighbors, no record of disturbances that might justify intervention. This absence of alarm complicated everything. The team debated quietly, weighing the risk of intrusion against the responsibility to act on what they now knew could no longer be dismissed as coincidence. They understood that if they were wrong, the consequences would ripple outward, affecting lives that had not asked to be pulled into an old mystery. They also understood that waiting carried its own cost, one measured not in paperwork but in time already lost. When they finally agreed to proceed, they did so without fanfare. Two unmarked vehicles arrived on the street on a clear morning, their presence subtle enough to avoid notice from passers-by. The detective approached the house with measured steps, aware of the weight of what might follow but careful not to let it dictate his demeanor. He knocked not sharply but firmly, the sound carrying through the quiet interior. After a moment the door opened, to reveal a man whose face bore the unmistakable marks of age, but retained the composure captured in decades-old descriptions. His expression reflected mild irritation rather than alarm, as though the interruption itself was more troubling than the reason for it. When the detective identified himself and explained that they needed to ask a few questions, the man listened without visible resistance, stepping aside to allow them entry. Inside the house was orderly arranged with the deliberate neatness of someone accustomed to control. There was nothing in the immediate space that suggested chaos or distress, nothing that would have justified concern at a glance. The detective noted this not as reassurance, but as another piece of the puzzle, aware that appearances in cases like this were often the least reliable indicators. They spoke briefly in the entryway, the detective asking neutral questions designed to establish routine, the man answering smoothly, his voice steady, his posture relaxed. When asked who else lived in the house, the man replied without hesitation, offering a name that matched the most recent records, spoken as though it had always belonged there. As they moved further inside, the detective's attention shifted to the subtler details, the way the man positioned himself between the officers and the interior of the house, the way his responses anticipated follow-up questions, the way he maintained a narrative without over-explaining. These were not individually signs of guilt, but together they reinforced the same impression investigators had encountered repeatedly throughout the case: confidence without proof, authority without foundation. When the detective requested to speak with the person listed as the dependent in the records, the man paused for the first time, his expression tightening just enough to be noticed. He did not refuse. Instead, he excused himself briefly, his footsteps measured as he moved deeper into the house. What happened next would not be understood fully until much later. At the time, the detective registered only the length of the silence, the way it stretched just a moment longer than expected, and the awareness that whatever lay beyond it would determine whether decades of waiting had been justified or misplaced. The hallway narrowed as they moved farther into the house, the walls closing in just enough to make the air feel heavier, and the detective found himself paying attention to small, unremarkable details that would later stay with him longer than any official report ever could. The carpet showed signs of careful maintenance, vacuum lines still visible, as though disorder was something not tolerated here. The doors along the hallway were all closed, their surfaces unmarked, giving nothing away. The man stopped in front of the last door on the left and reached for the handle with a steadiness that felt rehearsed rather than natural. He opened it without speaking. The room beyond was plainly furnished, neither childish nor fully adult, suspended somewhere in between, as if time itself had been paused and held there. A bed stood against one wall, made with precise corners. A small desk sat beneath a window where the light filtered in, softly illuminating stacks of neatly arranged books and papers. Nothing appeared out of place yet, nothing felt lived in either. And then the detective saw her. She was seated at the desk, her back straight, her hands folded loosely in front of her, as though she had been waiting to be addressed. She turned at the sound of the door opening, her expression composed, curious rather than alarmed. There was no sign of distress in her posture, no immediate indication that anything was wrong. The detective took a step forward, careful not to rush the moment, aware that the wrong tone, the wrong movement could fracture whatever fragile sense of order governed this room. He introduced himself quietly, using his name, his title, his voice, deliberately calm. He explained that they needed to ask her a few questions, that she was not in trouble, that she did not need to answer anything she did not understand. She listened without interrupting, her eyes flicking briefly toward the man in the doorway, before returning to the detective, a small movement that spoke volumes without drawing attention to itself. When the detective asked her name, she answered immediately, clearly, giving the one she had been using for years, the one attached to the paperwork, the one she had been taught belonged to her. There was no hesitation in her voice, no uncertainty, just the confidence of repetition. The detective did not correct her. Instead, he asked her how old she was. She gave a number that aligned perfectly with the dependent records, a number that made sense only if one accepted the life she had been living as complete and uninterrupted. He thanked her and asked if she knew why he was there. She shook her head, a small, controlled movement, her expression still neutral, still composed. Behind them, the man remained silent. The detective turned back to him, then asking questions he already knew the answers to, not because he needed information, but because he needed to observe. The man responded smoothly at first, his explanations practiced, his tone patient, as though this were a misunderstanding he expected to resolve quickly. But when the detective mentioned New Jersey, something shifted. It was subtle, barely perceptible, but it was there, a tightening around the eyes, a fractional delay before the response came. The man recovered quickly, dismissing the reference with a casual shrug, but the moment had already passed into memory. The detective asked to speak with the young woman alone. The request was framed politely, professionally, but it was not optional. For the first time since they arrived, the man objected. He did not raise his voice. He did not threaten. He simply insisted that there was no need, that everything could be handled together, that separation would only cause unnecessary confusion. The detective stood his ground. After a long pause, the man stepped back, his jaw set, his composure no longer effortless, and the door closed behind him with a soft click that sounded louder than it should have. The room felt different immediately. Without the man present, the silence took on a new quality, less controlled, less intentional. The detective pulled a chair closer, lowering himself to her level rather than standing over her, careful to adjust his posture so as not to intimidate. He spoke slowly, explaining that sometimes people were given information that was incomplete or untrue, and that his job was to make sure everyone had the full picture. He told her that she had not done anything wrong, that whatever she had been told before did not reflect on her. She listened, her brow furrowing slightly as though she were trying to reconcile his words with a framework that had never allowed for them. He asked if she remembered living anywhere else when she was younger. At first she shook her head automatically, the response, reflexive, practiced. But then she stopped, her expression changing as something unfamiliar surfaced. "I don't think so," she said, her voice quieter now. I don't remember." The detective nodded, acknowledging the uncertainty without pressing. He asked if she remembered a woman named Ella. The name landed differently. She did not respond immediately. Her hands tightened slightly where they rested together, her gaze drifting toward the window as though searching for something beyond it. "I've heard that name before," she said, finally, her voice tentative. "I don't know where." That was enough. The detective stepped out of the room and spoke quietly with his team, his voice steady despite the weight of what was unfolding. They agreed quickly on the next steps, understanding that whatever they did now would shape the rest of her life. The man was informed that he was being detained pending further investigation. He protested loudly at first, then with forced calm, insisting on his rights, on misunderstandings, on paperwork that would clear everything up. The words washed over the officers without effect. When they led him away, he turned once toward the closed door at the end of the hall, his expression unreadable. Inside the room, the young woman sat very still, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of voices raised, of movement, of authority she did not recognize. When the detective returned, she looked at him with a question in her eyes she did not yet have language for. "Am I in trouble?" she asked. "No," he said gently. "You're safe." She absorbed that slowly, testing the words as if they might dissolve under scrutiny. Later that day, after hours of careful procedures and quiet conversations after verification began, and documents were compared after photographs were retrieved from files long untouched, the truth finally took its shape. The girl seated at the desk was Sally Horner, not the 11-year-old who had walked away from her house believing she would return in a week, but the woman she had become in the years since, shaped by obedience, by control, by a story that had replaced her own. When Ella was told, she did not scream. She did not collapse. She closed her eyes and sat down, one hand gripping the edge of the chair as though the world had tilted slightly off its axis. Susan cried then openly, her body shaking with a release she had not allowed herself in years. "She's alive," she kept saying, as though repeating it might help it make sense. The reunion did not happen immediately. Professionals explained what to expect, what not to expect, how memory worked under prolonged influence, how recognition was not guaranteed. They spoke about patience, about boundaries, about the long process ahead. When the meeting finally took place, it was quiet. Sally entered the room carefully, her posture controlled, her expression guarded. Ella stood when she saw her, her breath catching painfully in her chest, every instinct screaming to close the distance between them. But she did not move. She waited. The space between them was filled with years neither knew how to cross. Sally looked at her, searching her face, reflecting confusion rather than recognition. Ella spoke her name softly, not as a demand but as an offering. "I'm your mother," she said. "I've been looking for you." Sally did not respond right away. Her gaze dropped, her hands clasping together the way they always had when she was thinking hard. "I was told my mother didn't want me," she said, finally, the words halting, uncertain. Ella shook her head, tears streaming freely now. "That was never true," she said. "Not for a single day. The road back would not be simple." But for the first time since that June morning decades earlier, the waiting was over. The courtroom was smaller than Sally had imagined. She had expected something grander, something that matched the weight of what had happened, but instead it was ordinary, almost disappointingly so. Wooden benches worn smooth by decades of use. Fluorescent lights that hummed softly overhead. A faint smell of old paper and cleaning solution that clung to everything. It felt like a place where routine lived, not reckoning. She sat beside her attorney, hands folded in her lap, listening as her name was spoken by people who did not know her. Each time it was said, she felt a small jolt, as if the sound had not yet settled comfortably into her body. For years, that name had not belonged to her. Now, it was everywhere. The man sat across the room, smaller somehow than she remembered him, stripped of the authority that had once defined the space around him. He no longer spoke for her. He no longer corrected or guided or explained. He stared straight ahead, jaw set, as if still trying to hold the world in place through sheer will. Sally did not look at him often. When the charges were read, she listened without expression, absorbing words that described her life in ways that felt both accurate and insufficient. Kidnapping, abuse, fraud. Each term landed with clinical precision, carving her story into segments that could be measured and argued over. None of them captured the long years of silence, the way obedience had felt safer than resistance, or how fear had learned to disguise itself as routine. She did not speak during the proceedings. That decision had been hers. The judge spoke at length, acknowledging the harm done, the years taken, the damage that could not be undone. The sentence, when it came, was severe enough to satisfy the law, though no number of years could balance what had already been lost. Sally felt no surge of triumph, no release. Only a quiet understanding that this part at least was finished. Outside the courthouse, the air felt different, lighter perhaps, though she could not say why. Ella stood a short distance away, hands clasped tightly in front of her, watching Sally with the same careful attention she had learned to practice since their reunion. She did not rush forward. She did not reach out. She waited. That waiting mattered. Sally approached slowly, uncertain, aware that every step carried meaning whether she intended it to or not. When she stopped in front of her mother, neither of them spoke right away. They had learned that words could arrive too quickly and do harm if they were not ready. "I don't know how to feel," Sally said, finally, her voice low. Ella nodded. "You don't have to," she replied. "Not yet." They stood together like that for a moment, close but not touching, sharing space without demanding anything of it. It was enough. The months that followed were quieter. There were appointments, of course, therapists, doctors, conversations that circled the same questions from different angles, each one peeling back another layer of a life shaped by control. Sally attended them dutifully at first, then with growing resistance, then eventually with a sense of cautious participation. Healing, she learned, was not something that happened to you. It was something you had to decide to engage in again and again, even on days when it felt pointless. Some memories returned in fragments. A street corner, the sound of a screen door closing, the way her mother's hands had always been warm. Other memories never came back at all, leaving behind only blank spaces that frustrated everyone except Sally, who had grown accustomed to living with gaps. Her relationship with Ella remained complicated. Love was there, undeniable and persistent, but it did not move in straight lines. Sally struggled with the expectation that reunion should feel natural, that affection should arrive fully formed. Some days, she wanted closeness. Other days, she needed distance so sharp it felt like rejection. Ella learned to accept both without complaint. She did not insist on being called Mom. She did not correct Sally when she hesitated. She let the relationship grow at its own pace, even when that pace was painfully slow. Susan found her own place in this new arrangement. She oscillated between fierce protectiveness and quiet resentment, emotions she did not always understand or like in herself. She loved her sister. She was grateful she was alive. And yet there were moments when anger surfaced. Anger at the years stolen, at the unfairness of it all, at the fact that reunion did not erase the past. She spoke about those feelings in therapy, learning that they did not make her disloyal, only human. Gradually, routines formed. Shared meals that did not revolve around heavy conversations. Walks taken without destination. Ordinary decisions about groceries, clothing schedules. Sally began to claim small pieces of autonomy, choosing what she wanted to eat, how she wanted to spend her time, when she wanted to be alone. Each choice mattered. There was a day nearly a year after the rescue when Sally stayed out later than expected and did not call. Ella noticed the time, felt the familiar tightening in her chest, then forced herself to wait. When Sally returned, apologetic but calm, Ella accepted the apology without interrogation. That moment marked a quiet turning point. Trust once broken does not return all at once. It is rebuilt through small acts of restraint, through decisions not to control, through the willingness to tolerate uncertainty. Sally began to see herself less as someone who had been rescued, and more as someone who had survived. That distinction changed everything. She enrolled in classes, tentative at first, uncertain of her footing among peers who had lived uninterrupted lives. She struggled with moments of disorientation, with the sense that she was always catching up to a world that had moved on without her. But she persisted, driven by a quiet determination that did not seek approval. On her birthday one year, Ella baked a cake without candles. They ate it together at the kitchen table, laughing at nothing in particular, talking about plans that did not involve the past. The absence of ceremony felt right. There would be time for celebration later if Sally wanted it. Not every day was good. There were setbacks. Nights when sleep did not come easily. Days when old patterns reasserted themselves, when obedience felt safer than choice. On those days, Sally withdrew, retreating into silence until the tension passed. No one forced her out of it. They had learned that pressure did not heal wounds. Patience did. As the years passed, the case receded into the background of Sally's life, no longer the defining feature of every conversation. It remained present, of course, a shadow she carried with her, but it no longer dictated every step. Ella grew older, softer around the edges, her fierce vigilance easing into something gentler. Susan watched her son grow, mindful, but no longer afraid of every unknown. The family settled into a rhythm that did not erase the past but made room for the future. There was no moment when everything felt resolved, no clear line where pain ended and peace began. Instead, there was continuity, imperfect, ongoing, alive. Sally sometimes spoke about the years she had lost, not with bitterness, but with a kind of measured sadness that acknowledged the truth without letting it dominate her. Other times she avoided the topic altogether, choosing instead to focus on what lay ahead. Both approaches were valid. In the end, what defined their lives was not the crime itself, but the refusal to let it be the only story that mattered. They did not seek inspiration from what had happened. They did not frame survival as triumph. They simply lived. And in doing so, they demonstrated something quieter and more enduring than closure. The possibility of moving forward without forgetting, of carrying truth without being crushed by it, and of allowing time not to heal all wounds, but to soften their edges enough that life could continue around. To them. If stories like this matter to you, stories that take their time, that listen carefully, and that try to honor the people at the center of them, you're welcome to stay with us. Subscribing simply means you won't miss the next story when it's ready. We're here to tell them slowly, thoughtfully, and with respect.